Alright, so in this video, I'm going to be taking a look back at what people like to call the Jamie Kilstein Delusion, and I'm going to be going over everything that went down with him afterwards, because a lot's happened since his first Joe Rogan appearance, and this is a wild story. And now looking back on it, I think he's given the Jamie Kilstein Delusion a whole nother meaning. So this guy Jamie, he's a comedian that went full SJW and turned into a male feminist in the late 2000s, early 2010s, when he started a podcast with his wife called Citizens Radio, and he started becoming more of an activist than a comedian. And here's some articles I found that paint a good picture of the kind of person he was at the time. Like, here's an article posted to the vegan subreddit about him. It's titled, "His name is Jamie Kilstein and he is a vegan comedian." And then you click on it and it goes to girlygirlarmy.com, and the article says, "Exclusive, vegans are not a-holes." And it talks about Jamie, and it says, "He is hands down the funniest person we know, and he also happens to be a vegan progressive badass of many colors." And I also found this article that he wrote, and it says, "I'm an alcoholic dude with an eating disorder. Hi." I mean, you can't make this shit up. He really had to add in hi at the end of that. It's too bad he wasn't trying to be ironic with all this, because this is some of the funniest shit I've ever read, and some of the tweets he was putting out at the time. Oh my god, this dude was out of control. And eventually he ended up going against the whole comedy scene pretty much. He started trying to cancel comedians. He wanted people to censor themselves. He thought jokes were going too far, and comedians just started hating him. Like, here's a clip of Jim Norton and Kurt Metzger talking about him. And Jim Norton sounds like he really used to like the guy. And Kurt Metzger's like, "No, dude, he's changed. Like, he tried to cancel me. He's gone full SJW."
No, this is where he tells you about your cis privilege.
I don't care about that. I like Jamie. I don't agree with him. I mean, I like him from way back, and I haven't...
He's a and he tried to help get me fired when that fucking...
Did he really?
Did he?
She who will remain unnamed started that thing to get me fired.
Did he really?
Yeah, he's a
As a
He was
comic?
part of it?
He's an utter scum. Yeah, you don't know about...
Oh, then fuck this
He has
dude.
turned into a total... Like, he's utterly awful.
He tried to get you fired?
He got in on it, like, on the Twitter thing.
Kurt, what you want me to do to this dude, man?
Nothing.
I
You've
get the
heard
wolves over that bridge, Kurt. They take care of this dude.
I'll say this, as comedians, we should never, I don't care what side you're on, you know, if a guy's not making threats to the president's life, you should never be trying to get another comic
comedian,
in trouble, only because what's going to get Kurt killed today, you're going to say something a month from now or 3 months from now or whatever, you're going to step on another landmine that's one group has put down.
You're cutting off your own head, man.
Alright, so now we're going to check out his first appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience back in 2012. And a month before he went on Joe's podcast, the Daniel Tosh joke incident happened. And before I get into that, I just want to mention that I recently started a Patreon account where I'm going to start posting 2 to 3 videos a month on there that are just on that platform. And then also, if any of my YouTube videos get taken down, I'm going to re-upload them there. Like, recently, one of my most popular videos about the Howard Stern show got blocked worldwide on YouTube, so nobody can watch it on here anymore. So I re-uploaded that on Patreon. And then also, this video that I'm currently making right here, there's a lot of words that have to be bleeped out in this, and I'm sure it's kind of annoying, so I uploaded this to Patreon uncensored, and the video is probably going to be 2 to 3 minutes longer. I added some extra clips in that one. So if you're interested in any of that, make sure you go check it out. It's $5 a month, and it'll definitely be worth it. I'll put a link to that down below in the description or in the comments section. So let's get back on track here. We're talking about the Daniel Tosh joke incident. If you're not familiar with that, it was in 2012, and it was one of the earlier moments of cancel culture, I guess, and people trying to censor comedians from saying things that people find offensive. So this was a pretty big story at the time, and I don't think there's any video of it, but this is how Joe described what happened.
Daniel Tosh was on stage, and he was talking to the audience about, you know, what should he talk about next, and someone yells out, "Rape."
Yep.
And he goes on, he starts saying, "Oh yeah, like that's funny," and like what's funny, the humiliation, what is it, the violence? He goes on this rant of all the things that are unfunny about rape, at which point some woman yells out, "Actually, nothing is funny about rape."
Right.
Like, to stop this conversation now, just all self-righteously. And he goes, "Wouldn't it be funny if like 5 guys raped her right now?" Which is the comedian thing to say in that scenario, and is in no way endorsing for this woman. But he had just gotten done, in her thick, stupid head, he had just gotten done saying all the things that are wrong with rape.
Right.
And she is so unironically arguing with him still, saying, "Actually, nothing is funny about rape." She's a fucking idiot. And then she goes online and writes a blog about it.
Sure.
A huge, dumb, stupid, diarrhea of the brain blog.
So, of course, as you know, Joe is really passionate when it comes to this kind of stuff. I mean, he's been talking about it for years now. Like, this was back in 2012, so things really haven't changed much for Joe and cancel culture. I mean, it's obviously only gotten worse, even though things do seem like they might be pushing back the other way now. But back in 2012, this was probably one of the first big examples of a comedian telling a harmless joke and somebody getting really offended and trying to cancel them. And Joe could definitely tell where all this is headed, so that's why he's so worked up about this issue, along with a lot of other comedians, I'm sure. But what did Jamie Kilstein think of this? Of course, he had to think of the most progressive take on all of it, and I think he had one of the funniest takes on all of it. When the Daniel Tosh incident happened, he tweeted this out. He said, "It's days like this, I hate my gender." And then he also said, "As a comedian, I find culture 100% more offensive than any heckling." So when Joe Rogan saw this, I'm sure he was thinking, I gotta straighten this guy out. I gotta have him on the podcast. I gotta talk to him about this. And that's what happened. He had him on the podcast, and in the first half of the podcast, things were pretty normal. Joe was being friendly with him. They were talking about some social issues, and Joe was actually agreeing with him on a lot of things. But then in the second half of the podcast, things got really ugly. And I like how this guy on Reddit described it at the time. He said, Joe tore this guy apart like a starved pit bull going after a steak. And it sounds like people had mixed opinions on this episode. I mean, everyone agreed with his point, I'm sure, and people knew that he won the argument, but people thought that he got way too worked up about it. This person said, Joe Rogan got overly aggressive towards the end. It kind of scared me a little. Another person said, Joe acted like a straight up in this episode, regardless whether his points are valid. But after this podcast, it just seemed like some of Joe's fans thought that he went too hard on Jamie, and he kind of set him up. He brought him in just to embarrass him and go after him on this issue. But how could he really not? Like, that tweet he put out, do you really expect Joe Rogan just to let him get away with that? That was like the cringiest thing ever. Of course, Joe needs to bring that up to him, and somebody needed to talk some sense into him, because this dude was clearly going down the wrong path. And if he listened to Joe, if he snapped out of it, things could have gone a lot better for him, and it would have saved him a lot of embarrassment. All right, so let's get into it here. This is when Joe starts talking to him about the whole Daniel Tosh incident and his tweet. And Brian Redband was hilarious on this podcast. He throws in a perfect Olive Garden reference right here.
Most comics defended it, and so I just wanted girls to know that I'm like, you know, if you've been through this, like,
man,
I don't. That's funny.
It's never funny. Real.
Unless it's at the
This
Olive
is just a
Garden.
work.
But yeah, man, I'm like, I just don't think we know what that's like. Where it's like
Yeah,
the
we
female
don't.
journalist,
You know what
the female
they
journalist
don't
I
know what it's like?
get
They
rape
don't
threats
like
every
trying to
fucking
get through
day.
a fucking show on Friday night and some dummy has to yell out something stupid. It doesn't make sense.
But again, I'm like, you can deal with that.
But that's
We've
not
both
what you're
dealt
not.
with
Yeah,
fucking that with
he did,
hecklers,
guess
'cause
what?
we're
He dealt
pros.
with it, and in my opinion, he dealt with it the right way. And that's not being pro. It's just being words. These are words. These
Sure.
are not. It's not actions, and it's not in support of in any way, shape, or fashion. It's a joke, and if you can't realize he's joking, you are unfit to listen to other human beings talk.
I don't know, man, but that's
and you're
saying that
if you're influenced by that, if you're influenced by Daniel Tosh saying, "Would it be funny if she got by 5 people?" If you were influenced by that, you are clearly mentally incapable of communicating with people.
I don't know, man.
You
It's
should
like
be removed from society.
Both me and you have heard jokes that were like, that sucks.
That wasn't a bad joke, dude.
Right? No. I'm saying everyone is subjective, and if you've been through a certain thing in your life, if you've been threatened with, or if you have been, or if you've been assaulted, or if you live in a culture where a lot of fucking girls are raped, that you know you have to think about walking home by yourself and shit like that. Maybe that shit's not as funny to you.
So whenever you hear somebody saying this kind of stuff, like these self-proclaimed male feminists, when you hear them talk like this, it usually seems like there's another motive behind what they're saying. You know, they're not saying it to try to stick up for all these helpless women out there. A lot of them are saying it so they can get closer to all these helpless women out there, unfortunately. And that's Jamie's case, as you could probably tell. And we'll definitely get into that later on in this video. But before that, we have a lot more to talk about with this podcast. And this next clip, this is part of the Jamie Kilstein Delusion, which is a YouTube video that somebody made documenting this at the time. And it shows Jamie talking about this on his podcast afterwards. And of course, he gave a completely different account of what happened on Joe's podcast. And he was acting like he won the argument, and he's trying to make Joe look really bad. And Joe even tweeted out this video at the time. So understandably, he wasn't too happy about this. So here's a clip of Jamie talking on his podcast, and then here's what actually happened on Joe's podcast.
I'm with that. After that, they go, well, wait, that means 1 in 6 guys are rapists. And then, like, that just infuriated them. They were mad, not because they're rapists, of course, but because it's making men look bad. They were mad at me that I put, I'm ashamed of my gender. And I go, right, because we rape a lot.
Yeah, guys can be creepy, right?
Yeah, but that's
when,
not
when you
that's
have dudes
crazy.
who are
That's not the. Hold on, stop.
Sure.
First of all, if you say that 1 in 6, does that mean 1 in 6 men? Does it mean that as well? Because if that's the case, I'm
Or
embarrassed
serial guys.
about that part of humanity,
Of course.
but not my fucking gender.
Joe,
that's ridiculous.
You're a comic. You've used like hyperbole. It's fucking
Right.
Twitter.
Exactly,
That
which
does-
is why him saying that someone being by 5 people being funny should also, whatever, did he say 7?
7.
Well, no, he said 5.
Oh.
Tosh said 5.
I was waiting for
Why
you to
do
be
have-
like,
Oh, you had to insert that 7. You hit you with a water bottle.
There-
It's his new thing. He says 7 all
there
the
was
time.
So like I said, Brian was on fire this podcast. Not only did we get an Olive Garden, but we also got a 7. And then right here, he makes a really good point. He's like, dude, what about all the people listening to this podcast? They're hearing the word every 5 seconds. Aren't they going to be triggered by that?
When he made a joke, she's not a rape survivor, man.
no, I'm saying in the audience.
But
Anyone.
she's the victim. She's the person who got said that
What about
word
the audience
to.
right now of this
Yeah.
podcast, though? I
Yeah,
don't get that.
exactly.
There's tons of
And-
fucking people probably sitting around shaking. On
Yeah,
the
you
floor.
don't have a problem with that. This is a bullshit argument,
No,
man.
because
It really is.
because we're actually like talking about the issue because it's an issue that's important to be talked about. Again, I didn't read anyone, and I certainly wasn't saying anyone. You can't talk about don't say the
murder
word
is
rape.
horrible. Robbery is horrible. Armed robbery, car robbery, everything is horrible.
But
It
when
doesn't
someone gets-
mean
but when someone
that
gets-
just because it exists, you can never talk
Of
about
course,
it because
but
out
when-
of fear
when someone
that
get-
someone in the
when
audience may have
someone gets-
experienced it.
when-
So after this, Joe starts getting really worked up, and it's hilarious. This rant he goes on right here, this is probably one of the best rants he's ever done. He just starts going off, and Jamie just sits there and takes it, which he should. I mean, if you put out a tweet like this, you deserve to be yelled at by Joe Rogan for an hour.
Comedian in the world disagrees with you.
But I'm like, I don't care.
You know what
I
that
don't
is,
care.
though. As
Like,
a
comedy
comic,
doesn't
you
mean that much
understand
to
what's
me.
going on. It's not that comedy means much to you. It's in human interaction, man. It's when you're in a movie and some guy's on his f***ing phone talking. Shut up, bitch. You're
Sure.
fucking up the show. It's real simple.
Right.
That's and what Tosh did is stop what was fucking up the show. It had nothing to do with rape or contributing to
But
culture.
again, like when something like what you just said happens, like people don't galvanize around that. You know what I mean?
They shouldn't. They should galvanize around putting a picture of her and say, see this bitch? She doesn't understand humor. She can't take a joke. So she'd be a photo of her with a red line across her face until you can come in and explain to us that you're sorry, that you didn't understand how he was joking around about how nothing can be funny about and you just blurted it out because you're a self-righteous dummy who thinks that you should be able to espouse your politically correct opinions at any time they're warranted in your silly little fucking dumb mind, including hijacking a fucking comedy club. You're not capable of handling a comedy club. You shouldn't be there. Just like if your ears hurt when things are loud, you shouldn't go to a fucking rock club. If you're scared of violence, you shouldn't sit front row at a UFC fight. It's all the same. It's not like we should nerf the world to make it safe for everybody. If you don't enjoy someone talking about controversial, you certainly shouldn't go to an adult nightclub that's doing stand-up comedy, or a guy like Daniel fucking Tosh, who has one of the most edgy shows on TV, period, is doing his stand-up, and he makes a joke because you heckle, and that joke happens about what you heckled about.
Right, but people-
You can't feel like you're a victim, because you're not a victim. You're a dummy who doesn't belong in a comedy club.
Right. Well, again, I'm not
I
defending
went to
the
see.
heckling. I'm
I
not
went to see
defending
Guns
the
N'
heckling.
Roses and my ears hurt. You're stupid. If your ears are sensitive, you don't stand next to the fucking speaker. If you don't like watching dudes get their ass kicked, don't go to a UFC fight. If you don't like black people, don't watch basketball. It's really simple. It's really simple.
Did you
And
just
when
end-
you
did you just end
introduce
racism?
yourself, if you introduce yourself into the equation like that woman did, you got to take the hit.
But
You
this-
got to take the hit.
But again, like you thought it was, you know, and we were talking about how good it is when people stand up and protest these fucking politicians and stuff. You disagree with this, so of course you. And again, I disagree with the heckling. We both disagree with
This is a stand-up
we both
comedy show. This
disagree with
isn't
the
someone
heckling.
dictating policy or changing the way people live their lives. It's someone who's cracking jokes on stage trying to make people laugh.
But again,
it's someone who interrupts that process because they're dumb.
And I hate.
So while they're in the middle of all this, Brian pulls up a video, and it's some news panel talking about the Daniel Tosh incident. And of course, they're all offended by it. They're like, that was too far. That wasn't a joke. He was being serious. He was making a statement. And one of the ladies on the panel was Liz Winstead, who I guess Joe knows from like 20 years ago, back when he started comedy. And he tells a story about how she was hosting open mic nights, and she would have specific words you couldn't say, specific things you couldn't joke about. And if you did, she would stop the set and make you get off the stage. So this is the first time I think Joe had to deal with anything like this. And when she did to him, of course, he just went off on her.
And I'm in the middle of something, and she comes out and says, "Sexism, stop. And I said, "Liz, don't you get enough attention?" I go, "You go on stage every night, you have this HBO special, you're a national headliner, and yet you can't let an open micer have 5 minutes to try to say whatever the they want to say. You have to come on and interrupt." So she says to me, "I know the people who own this club. I'll just let you know right now. This is 100% real." And I said, "That's it, really." I go, "That's what you're telling me. You're a professional comedian, and I have a very good point about you needing attention and interrupting sets, and you tell me that you know the people who book this club, insinuating that you can stop me from working here." I go, "Really?" I go, "I'm done." And so I walked off the stage. I put the microphone down and I walked off the stage. And I'll never forget that. And so listening to that lady, just understand and judge that.
Well, I mean,
because that's a true thing that
gets
happened
better, Jeff.
to oh, of course it does. But that's a true thing that happened to a open mic comic by a professional headliner comedian.
Sure, and
this is the point where sexism can bounce the other way.
Well,
and it becomes nonsense. It becomes you enforcing your ideology on other people, and it's not about being fair and right and running a just, happy society where people are allowed creative differences. No, it's about you enforcing your own ego and bullshit on other people.
Then towards the end of this, Joe and Brian bring up how murder is worse than and you can make murder jokes whenever. Nobody really cares. Like if Daniel Tosh made a joke towards that lady, like, "Hey, what if a bunch of people just murdered you right now?" Nobody would be offended by that. So they start bringing that up, and Jamie's trying to defend himself by making it sound like rape is worse than murder. And eventually Joe's like, "So would you rather be murdered than raped?" And you can tell Jamie doesn't want to answer the question, and he just doesn't know what to say.
Situation happened, and it was a murder joke that would be okay. That's what you're saying. And I say that's crazy.
Here's what I'm saying, because I think we're talking in circles.
No, because we're talking about comedy, man. We're not talking about reality. That's my point. You know that if someone says, "Wouldn't it be funny if somebody just murdered him?" You know that that's worse than saying, "Wouldn't it be funny if someone just raped him?"
That's not worse.
It is worse.
Not worse.
Murder's worse.
Murder's way worse than
Murder is worse than man.
I don't think we can have this conversation.
You're
man.
crazy. You would rather be murdered.
What's that?
You would rather be murdered.
Then
Yes, you would rather be murdered.
I would rather, if someone is gonna have to live with none of us will have to understand.
You're saying murder's
But
worse
again,
than rape.
none of us understand what these fucking girls are going through.
I'm not talking about that, man. I'm talking about is murder worse than rape? I say it is.
For me?
Yes.
Yeah, of course. I would rather.
And for every other fucking human being that's ever lived, murder's worse than.
Don't fucking know what they're going through. We don't. And the fact
Jamie, you're talking nonsense. You keep bringing up feelings, keep going to weird shit and victimization.
Yeah, so like I showed you in the beginning, a lot of people after this episode thought that Joe was getting too worked up, but I think he just knew where things were headed with all this. He knew things weren't getting any better. And now looking back on the whole Daniel Tosh incident, it's definitely one of the earlier signs of what's to come with cancel culture. All right, so I just want to play one more clip from this podcast, and it's Brian Redband again. He makes a joke to end this podcast on the perfect note.
Endorsing rape. It's not saying people should be, allowed to say horrible things to people. It's you're not dealing with the context of the situation where someone was reacting to someone saying something dumb.
I'm gonna rip that bathroom in a bit.
Are you gonna?
Yeah.
Can I pee first?
Sure.
Do you have to go?
Do I have to pee? Yeah, well, I was supposed to go like half an hour ago.
All right, so now let's move on to what's happened with Jamie since this podcast. He continued on with his own podcast with his wife until 2017 when shit hit the fan for him. What do you know? Some disturbing allegations were made against him, and they pretty much destroyed his whole career. He had to leave his podcast. He lost all of his fans, and everyone just turned on him. The mob that he used to please, the woke mob, they all just ate him alive. Even the company that I used to write for, that article that we saw in the beginning about how he has an eating disorder and he's an alcoholic and all that shit, they were one of the biggest media companies reporting on this. And I'm sure a lot of people knew this was bound to happen eventually. Like Jim Norton, Kurt Metzger in the beginning, that clip I played, like they said at the end, like, dude, you better be careful because eventually you're going to step on one of those mines and who's going to want to come save you? And funny enough, it sounded like all these comedians were there for him and they welcomed him right back. He said when he was down at his worst, all these comedians were reaching out to him and making sure he was all right. Then he went on Joe Rogan's podcast, which we'll get to. But first, I just want to talk about these allegations a little bit and what happened and everything. I believe this was at the height of the Me Too movement. Like Harvey Weinstein just got busted busted, and every day there's somebody new taking a hit. And some of these accusations were really bad and should be taken very seriously, like Harvey Weinstein and Bill Cosby. But then some of the other ones just seem like clickbait, and there's really nothing there once you looked into it. And in Jamie's case, it's kind of hard to tell, but if you read these articles, if you just look at the headline and you read the article, the worst sounding part here is the headline, at least for the ones that I read. Maybe some other ones are different. Like the company that he used to write for, Jezebel, they said that some disturbing allegations came out, which sounds pretty bad, especially for the time. At this time, if some disturbing allegations came out against you, you're probably going to be in some trouble. And if your whole fan base is just SJW people that have listened to you for years going after people for similar shit to this, which Jamie admitted he used to do all the time, he would just read article headlines and go after whoever was accused of anything and act like it was true. So he ended up getting a taste of his own medicine. And if you look in these articles, you know, it sounds like he's a creepy guy. I'm not going to deny that. But if you just read some of this stuff, like this article from Jezebel, the place that he used to work for, that talked about the disturbing allegations, just listen to this first paragraph. For years, Kilstein was a prime example of how a good progressive man should act, but multiple women have recently come forward with stories of being singled out by the popular comedian they had long admired, who they said he exploited his status and feminist principles to make sexual advances towards them. The allegations and subsequent response has launched a conversation about allyship and men who call themselves feminists, adding to a slowly developing conversation about misogyny and comedy. And then a little further down, they talk about a tweet that somebody made about it. They said, after Jamie Kilstein, I'm done with male feminists. If you throw that term around, you're suspect to me. And then here are some quotes from one of the girls that came out with the allegations. She said, it was like a creepy dude at a bar, trying to get him to leave you alone by bringing up a boyfriend. She said, I thought, this is a feminist. I shouldn't have to have another man kind of dissuade him from being a creepy and respecting my boundaries. She said Kilstein offered to send her gifts, fly her out to Ohio to meet her, and told her he'd never met another girl like her. So that's definitely some disturbing stuff going on there. I can't believe he said to a girl that he's never met another girl like her. Oh, what a disgusting thing to say to somebody. And then he wanted to send her gifts. This man needs to be locked up. So then later on in this article, one of the girls says she heard him refer to all the girls he's sleeping with on tour as road fucks on his podcast. And then in parentheses it says, Jezebel was not able to find the episode containing this quote, which makes sense because I doubt he ever said that as a male feminist on a podcast with his wife talking to a bunch of SJWs. I mean, I don't want to defend this guy so much, but this all just sounds so ridiculous. And then the girl went on to say, as someone who listens religiously, I knew that he was speaking about me, she said. All of the trauma came crashing back down. So I don't know, maybe there is more to this that I missed and it's a lot worse. Let me know down in the comments, but all this just doesn't sound that bad to me. It sounds like the worst thing he did was he kept talking to a girl when maybe she didn't want him talking to her, and he's being a little creepy, which sounds right. I mean, he's a male feminist. What do you expect? This guy is just using that to get with girls, and that's what it sounds like they're mostly upset about, that he was using that as a disguise to get with them, and that's why they ended up canceling him. And he was married at the time, but he claims they're in an open relationship, so who knows? I think this Reddit post summarizes it well. They said he built his persona on being the ultimate SJW, then it was uncovered he's a regular dude trying to get laid. In the SJW world, being a regular dude trying to get laid is like the worst thing imaginable. I don't see how he recovers from this. So he really set himself up for failure. Like he said, he was addicted to social media. He loved going after people because it would get him attention, and he got all these listeners, and all these girls loved him because he talked about these issues that no other guy was talking about, and he obviously thought that this would help him get girls. That was probably a big part of it, and in reality it really doesn't help that much, because it sounded like once these girls realized that he was coming on to them, that's when they wanted to stop talking to him, and that's what they got upset about, because they thought he was just some guy that wanted to help with feminist issues, and he was somebody that they could trust and trust not to come on to them. But like that Reddit post said, he's like every other dude, he just wants to get laid. So the whole male feminist strategy is not a good one. So a little while after all these allegations came out, he ended up going back on Joe's podcast to talk about everything that went down, because a lot's changed since he was first on Joe's podcast. And in the end, it sounds like these allegations were probably a good thing that they came out, because something like this was going to happen sooner or later, and this was a good wake-up call for him. It sounded like he was consumed by social media. He was miserable. His whole life was just trying to get likes on Twitter by attacking people every day, and he pretty much gave up on comedy. So let's get into it now and hear what he has to say about the whole thing.
You used to be the host of, or one of the co-hosts of Citizen Radio, like super progressive, lefty podcast.
a lot changed. I went into hiding. I went into hiding.
What happened? Because I only got like a peripheral story of like what went sideways.
All right.
But like some girls accused you of.
Well, yeah. So here's what happened. So it kind of started where I was a comic for years, and as it got more progressive, it got more into that judgmental territory, I guess, where I feel like I definitely became one of those people who would just be on Twitter all day. And instead of sort of talking about real issues, it just becomes like, who are we mad at that day? Like, who used the wrong word that day? Who can we get fired that day? Yeah. And it's Twitter mob stuff, and it happens on the right and it happens on the left. It's just like kind of just people who are sad who just live like in their box, which I was like one of them, right?
That's why I think this is such an important conversation, because you've kind of stepped away from it and you see it for what it is. I think people don't realize it when they're caught up in the swirl of it, the momentum of it, that it's almost like a natural human behavior pattern. It's very tribal.
Yeah, well, it's tribal and it's physically addictive.
Yeah.
Like I've like gone back and forth with like drinking and not drinking and pot and not smoking pot. And I can tell you that the thing I was addicted to the most was Twitter. It was refreshing Twitter. It was like you literally get dopamine hits from that.
Yeah.
Like I remember when I first tried to get off Twitter, I was fighting with some fucking stranger in my living room on Twitter, and I was like, you know what? F this. I'm gonna go take a walk. I don't need to be involved in this guy's life. I closed it, and before I even knew it, I'm like walking in the park, fighting with some other guy on my fucking phone, and I'm like, it follows you.
I say this a lot on my channel, but Twitter is the absolute worst for anybody. Look at Jordan Peterson. It's broken that man. So, maybe Jamie's kind of using that as an excuse and everything, but I definitely believe that he's probably addicted to it, and it's probably a lot better now that he's off of it. Like I said, these allegations coming out is probably the best thing for him. If it got him off of Twitter, got him away from that whole SJW mob, I would imagine that he's definitely better off now than before, which I think he even admits on this podcast. I think he says that right after the allegations came out, it was rough, but now he's never been happier, and he's still a progressive and everything, but he's toned it down a lot, and I think he knows his place now.
You were getting a lot of praise, and you were being hailed. Like I saw Jezebel wrote something where they called you a great example of an ally.
Well, that was pre this year, Jezebel.
Yeah, but that expression is a very odd expression. I mean, I hate to sound like this disingenuous egalitarian, but I really do believe this. I mean, we should be allies to each other. We all should be. This idea that like there's a goddamn team war going on, and that Jamie Kilstein is out there bucking for the females. Right. But that's what it's like. It's like that's what they. But they reward that.
Yeah.
See,
you find that tribe.
Yes.
And you do find people who are going, yeah. And the more you attack on Twitter, because not just blogs, like remember, like individuals on Twitter, like me, like when I would see like who's getting piled on today.
Right.
Okay, cool. This writer wrote something about mansplaining. Don't need to read the article. What's the hashtag? That's the hashtag. I'm going to say the fucking meanest funny thing because I'm a comic and I'm funnier than journalists. And then famous people are going to retweet me or fave me. And then I get to feel like a fucking civil rights hero. Right. Because that's what would happen, where like I would literally tweet, even if not even a joke, even if I tweeted something sincere, and this like sucks to admit, but even if I tweeted something like hashtag Black Lives Matter, I'm refreshing that shit to be like, did Questlove favorite it? You know what I mean? Like, right. I'm not doing it to be, and then you can feel good about yourself. Then you can go, not saying I did this, but you can go on the street and you can ignore the homeless person, and you can cross the street when you see like the scary black guy, because you're just like, well, I'm technically the Rosa Parks of Twitter because I tweeted that joke at that writer who said thing that no one's going to remember tomorrow, but we were all angry about today.
So also obviously him and Joe got into all the allegations, and Jamie was defending himself and talking about what happened, and even Joe's like, I don't even understand what you did wrong. But Jamie admits in the past he'd go after people for doing the same kind of thing, and he thought of himself as invincible. He thought he was doing all the right things, and that's the problem. The way he'd go after people, his fans must have thought that he was a perfect person, he wouldn't do anything wrong. Like if he was just a regular comedian, this probably wouldn't have even affected him. It would have been like an Aziz situation.
So
they were saying, but it was very unspecific what I read. They said predatory behavior, and I was like, oh, meaning he's trying to get laid. That's what a man does. Like not predatory in the sense of you're victimizing someone or raping someone or doing something horrible to someone or even.
And this is when my own words kind of bit me in the ass, because I spent an entire year or years being like, hashtag believe women, and then you read that and you go, hashtag don't believe women. Like, you don't know what to do. And like, I was always like, if you call a girl who accuses you, crazy, you're just projecting, and like you're trying to. And then suddenly I'm reading this article, I'm like, crazy, and I didn't all of my stuff.
Hold on, what article? Are you talking about the Jezebel?
So there's a Jezebel,
article?
yeah, there's a Jezebel article, and
hell hath no fury like a woman scorned.
oh man, it was really bad, and I read it for the first time, and I don't want to go into details because I don't want to shit on people who like feel like they were, hurt or whatever. But a good majority of the article isn't even true. There was one part where Jezebel even wrote it. Like, if we can make it about journalism.
Well, let's not even say Jezebel because it's one woman who wrote it. There's several,
totally. So the author, there's one moment in it, and I'll try to make this about journalism and not about the woman, but one of the complaints about me was I had a consensual night with a lady in Nashville who, I guess because she like listened to the show, maybe they're like, that's predatory because you're like famous. And I was like, well, no one else thinks I'm famous.
But wait a minute. They were defining it as predatory because you're famous?
That's part of it.
So every time Mick Jagger gets laid, it's predatory?
That's part of it. Like, yeah, the predatory stuff specifically was that. And then what was even more about the article was it said, and I'm not going to quote exactly. She also wrote into another podcast, and I heard this. But essentially what the woman said, we did not sleep together. It alluded that we slept together. It didn't say that I was in an open relationship, but we didn't sleep together. She told me she didn't want to sleep together, and I was like, great, no problem. She's like, I don't want it to go further than that,
Okay.
So I was like, cool. Even if you change your mind, we're not going to do it. Got it. And then in the article about me being a predator, it's like, I felt so safe and it was a great night. And I was like, this sounds like an article about me being a good dude. And then it said, but then weeks later, she heard on the podcast that she was just a quote wrote. And then Jezebel, in parentheses, this one author from Jezebel, in parentheses, said, Jezebel could not find the clip. Right, because it doesn't fucking exist, because I'm not going to call someone a road next to my wife on my feminist podcast.
Not only that, you're not going to say it if you didn't even have sex with them.
And we didn't have sex. Right.
Real problem with writing things about people. And one of the real problems with writing things about people is they don't get a chance to respond in real time to the things you're saying. So you establish a narrative and then you keep going with it. You write paragraph after paragraph with no one responding to that.
Yeah, and months later,
no counter to it.
I saw like the woman who wrote the article, like there was a request in my like other inbox in Facebook that like you don't even see, and like for a comment. So like, I mean, I guess she did reach out, but at that point I was. So here's what happened, and this goes to your question before, because I had called so many people sexist, because I had sort of made my almost career by that. It was fun, man. When people heard about this, like, and you see the headlines, and this is another like problem with like clickbait journalism. The headlines look like I was accused of. There was a one article that used the word sexual harassment, conduct was in all the headlines.
And what is that?
I have no
It's a weird
idea.
one, because I've seen that one about people connected to Harvey Weinstein.
Yeah.
Saying, like about Ben Affleck, they called it sexual misconduct.
Dude,
like,
so there was no reason to root for me. There wasn't a strong enough fan base. It wasn't like if, a bigger comic gets accused of something. Well, he has thousands or millions of fans, and then this small community who are accusing him of something. I had sort of nobody, and when I burnt all the bridges in comedy, and, I never just showed up at clubs to do sets and stuff like that. I just had this audience and sort of thought I could never get fired, Yeah, this is sort of the problem with acting like you don't have flaws. And
right.
I always did. I thought on the show, my favorite parts of my show were when I talked about depression or alcoholism, and we would get emails in from people who, it said it really helped them. And I wanted to talk so much more about that stuff. Mm-hmm. Because I do think it's important to examine your flaws, but on a political level, I held myself up as like in untouchable.
Well, I think you were doing essentially the same thing that you were talking about doing on Twitter, where you're addicted to this positive response, and you're addicted to saying these things about people and attacking people. It's a real problem on the left.
So I think people should take all this as a real cautionary tale for any male feminist out there. And I think that's really what the Kilstein Delusion is. A male feminist who thinks he could use that to get laid, and it all ends up backfiring on him because it just does not work. And actually, while I was doing research for this video, I came across this Reddit post that's like a year old. And it says, PSA, Jamie Kilstein was my BJJ coach. Then he tried to break up my marriage, so he was fired and moved to Austin. Don't let him teach at your schools. And it's got a lot of upvotes, and it seems pretty legit. So make sure you don't let your wife around this guy. He might try to break up your marriage. So also on this podcast, they did talk about the Daniel Tosh incident a little bit. And it sounds like Jamie's just coming up with excuses for why he put out that tweet and was defending that lady. He claims he just didn't know the context surrounding it, and he wasn't hanging out with comedians anymore, and he wasn't that into the comedy scene.
So I am known as this male feminist, which again, and it kind of becomes my thing. So I go on your show. We argue about it because I'm like, I don't have comic friends anymore. So I take this side. And I didn't hear all about the joke. Like, I just heard the whole Daniel Tosh story I heard at the Stanhope show for the first time, because the articles I read don't have the nuanced parts, right? Okay, so I was on the not comic side of that. And by then, I wasn't doing comedy clubs. I was never really accepted into comedy clubs. I'm just playing for my progressive audience at like a vegan coffee house. Like, I'm just playing random like little rock gigs for like my audience. So again, echo chamber, right? And I'm not hanging out with comics. So when people are like, why aren't you defending a comic? I'm like, I don't know, man, because I don't think I am one. Like, I didn't really consider myself one.
All right, so that's about it for this video. Thanks for watching, and remember the Patreon page is up now. If you want to see any bonus content, if you want to send videos that were taken off YouTube, make sure you go check that out. And thanks for watching. Make sure you hit the like button, leave me a comment, let me know what you think about all this, then hit the subscribe button, and I'll catch you at the next video.